Welcome to the 13th hole of the Adventure Golf unit. We are going to begin looking at circles. Quickly reviewing what we've just covered, the area of a square is the side length squared. Area of a rectangle is base times height. Area of a parallelogram is base times height, where the base and height are perpendicular. Area of a triangle is base times height divided by 2 or times 1/2. Area of a trapezoid, we're going to find the average of our two bases by adding them together in parentheses and then dividing by 2, and then multiply by the height of the trapezoid. When we're looking at circles, two key terms, please pause this as long as you need to. The circumference is the distance around the circle, and pi is a ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. So a ratio, I remind you, is a comparison of numbers. It's comparing the circumference to the diameter. In other words, it's a division problem. If I take the circumference divided by the diameter, I'm going to get pi, and if I rearrange this by multiplying by diameter on each side, property of equality says I have to do whatever I do to one side, I must do to the other. So diameter times pi, those cancel out. Circumference is equal to pi times diameter, or C equals pi times D. A second formula that can also be used to find circumference is if I think about the diameter is the distance all the way across the circle from one side to another going through the center point. The diameter is equal to 2 times the radius. So 2 times the radius times pi is another way of rewriting this. More commonly, it's written as circumference equals 2 pi r, where pi times diameter is the same thing as 2 times the radius times pi, but the commutative property allows me to switch the order because I'm multiplying everything. Calculating the circumference, if I look at this first circle, I'm going to show you two different ways to calculate circumference. The first way is to get an exact answer. In this case, I know that circumference is equal to pi times diameter, and my diameter is actually given, so my circumference here would be 13 pi. And that's leaving it in terms of pi, that's an exact answer. Now if I actually punch this into a calculator, 13 times pi, I end up with an answer rounded to the nearest hundredth of 40.84. Now, circumference is measuring the distance around the outside, or the length around the outside. I'm only measuring one dimension, so my units should only have one dimension. I'm not squaring the meters here. I'm talking about if I started walking here and walked all the way around the outside of the circle, how far would I walk by the time I gotten back here? That distance would be 40.84 meters, equivalent to 13 pi. I'm going to go ahead and pull up all the examples we're working with here. Again, my circumference is given. So circumference is equal to pi times diameter. The diameter is 9. 9 times pi, or if I punch that in, 9 pi would be 28.27. And again, my units would just be meters. In this case, I am given a radius, so I can use 2 times pi times r. And if I plug 10 in for r, 2 times pi times 10. And then I use the commutative property and I put my like terms next to each other. 2 times 10 times pi would give me a circumference of 20 pi, and my units would still be centimeters. If I actually punch that in to a calculator, 20 pi would be 62.83 centimeters, would be a rounded circumference. If you're more familiar with one formula than the other, I, for example, only use pi times diameter. When I'm given something other than the diameter, I just complete it. I complete the diameter. I turn the radius into the diameter, and I think of this as being 10. When half of it was 5, the entire segment across here would be 10. So my circumference here would be 10 pi, or pi times 10, which would be 314. I'm sorry, 31.4. And down here, my circumference is going to be pi times diameter, 6.5 pi, which would be, if I punch it into a calculator, 20.42 would be a rounded. And here my units would have been feet, and in this case my units would be meters. So again, when you're looking for an exact answer, just leave it in terms of pi, and if you're okay with a rounded answer, you can go ahead and round to the nearest hundredth, which I've done on these examples. If I'm looking for area, area is the product of pi and the radius squared. Now I'm talking about how many of these little squares would it take to cover this circle. In this case, my radius is given, so pi times my radius squared, pi r squared. 8 times 8 is 64, so my answer here would be 64 pi. And my units would be millimeters squared, because now I'm talking about area. So it would be units squared. The difference between 64 pi squared and 64 pi, or 64 pi millimeters squared and 64 pi millimeters, this is talking about area, this is talking about a length. So in this case, that is not what I'm looking for. If I punch in 64 or pi times r squared, pi times 8 squared would actually calculate out to be 201.06 when I rounded. So pi times 8 squared would equal 201.06 millimeters squared. 4 more examples. Pi times 11.5 squared, pi times radius squared. If I punch that into my calculator, I end up with a radius or an area of 415.48 centimeters squared. And if I leave that an exact answer as an exact answer, I would end up with 132.25 pi. I just squared this and then put it in front of the pi. And this would also be in centimeters squared. Pi times 12 squared, which would be 144 pi. And my units here would be in meters squared. It's important to put the units, that way I'm not confusing area with circumference. 144 pi comes out to be 452.39 when I've rounded, meters squared. Come down here, pi times 6 squared, feet squared, and 6 squared would be 36, so it would be 36 pi feet squared. And if I actually solve that, 36 pi would be 113.1 feet squared would be the area. So it would take 113 squares to cover this circle. In this case, I'm actually given the diameter, which means before I can calculate area, I must find what the radius would be. And if it's 9 all the way across, it must be 4.5 for the radius. So pi times my radius squared would give me 63.62 centimeters squared. Or if I do 4.5 squared and leave this in terms of an exact answer, it would be 20.25 pi centimeters squared. Again, you notice every answer must have units. When we're talking about area, we're talking about units squared. You're now ready to get online and print out the 13th hole scorecard.